Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our participants. I know we've got people calling in from all over the world, so I hope everybody's about to have a good day or have had a good day, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, which is jointly hosted by EMIG and the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals. The title is Enhancing Evidence Generation and Publication Strategies to Support and Strengthen Regulatory and HTA Submissions. And this webinar is a very good fit with the EMIG strategy. EMIG, as many of you will know, and if you don't know, is a very forward-thinking, pragmatic um, pharmaceutical company network. And they take a 360-degree approach to looking at the issues and challenges in the system. And while they recognize that there needs to be change and flexibility in all parts of the system to get new innovation, new treatments, new interventions to patients, they also recognize that better research is really, really important, and better evidence into the ecosystem is critical. For too long, the system has relied heavily on regulatory data, and regulatory research is designed to answer regulatory questions for regulators, not to answer questions for all decision makers in the system. And EMIG have recognized this through their Better Research for Better Outcomes initiative. And as part of that, we kind of stumbled upon our colleagues from the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals, and they introduced us to this concept of strategic publication management. And I didn't know what it was to begin with. And then I learned about it and I thought, my goodness, this is brilliant. This is fascinating. And to try and fix problems in the system and try to improve evidence development is difficult. And it will take several different approaches. But one approach is to have a more strategic and structured and forward-thinking approach to publication management. And I'm completely convinced that if we do this properly, it will have a massive material impact on our ability to improve research and to better convey and articulate research results to different decision makers through really good, high quality and timely publications, not just at the point of regulatory and HTA approval, but also into the life cycle of medicines and new technologies as the data improves and real world evidence becomes evident over time. So against that backdrop, I'm super excited about this webinar and very much looking forward to hearing from our esteemed panel. There are no housekeeping notes as such. Everybody is very welcome. We hope the talks will stimulate lots of questions. Please use the chat function to ask questions. And at the end of each talk and at the end of both talks, we'll have the opportunity to ask the panel all of your questions. This will be recorded and there will be a wide distribution of the recording and of the outputs from the webinar. And EMIG have very graciously opened this webinar up to non-EMIG members, which is fantastic, which means its reach will be even greater. So without further ado, I'm just going to quickly take you through the agenda. So we've only got an hour, so we'll get through things very quickly. But we've essentially got two talks from Richard and Suzanne. The first one is Understanding Integrated Evidence Generation Planning. It's a super, super fascinating talk. I've heard the run through from Richard, and it's one of the most compelling talks I've heard for a very, very long time. And equally, Suzanne is going to give a brilliant presentation just around the planning, the why, the what, and the how. So Richard will talk a little bit about the theory, and Suzanne will talk about how to put all this into action. And then I will do my best to effectively manage a Q&A at the end. So if we go to the next slide, this is the panel, Eric, Suzanne, and Richard. I'm obviously Eric, and Richard and Suzanne will introduce themselves just ahead of their talk. They know themselves way better than me and will do a much better job. So our objectives for today is just to get into describing and understanding what an integrated evidence generation plan involves and why it's critical for regulatory and HTA success. We'll also define a strategic publication plan and how it informs wider data dissemination and stakeholder engagement. We'll provide an overview of the importance of following GPP guidelines, which is super, super important and will go a long way to ensuring the quality and validity of the publications, and outline the resources and training opportunities for evidence generation and high quality publication strategies that are available. So these are our objectives. A quick disclaimer, the information presented reflects the personal knowledge and opinions of the panel and faculty. It does not necessarily represent the position of ISMPP or their current or past employers. So they can say whatever they want, which is great. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll pass over to Richard, who will do a short introduction and then take you through his presentation. So thank you, Richard.
Many thanks, Eric, for that great introduction. So yes, I'm Richard White. I'm representing today the International Society of Medical Publications Professionals, or ISMAP, along with Suzanne. I'm also Chief Operating Officer at Oxford Pharmagenesis, and we're a global health science consultancy that supports pharma, biotech, and device companies with evidence planning, publications, value demonstration, and so on. So I'm talking today about the importance of better research and publications leading to better care, particularly integrated evidence generation planning. So it's logical then that I start with a slide on cars. Great value. And I like analogies. So I'm going to ask everyone a question at the top of this slide. Which car is the better value for money? Is it Smart or is it Porsche? Just have a think of that. Maybe you've got the chat open. There's, I think, 20 odd of you on there. If you want to put Smart or Porsche into the chat, please feel free to do so and we'll see your answer. But I'll keep talking on this, and to help you with the assessment, I've put some characteristics there for each of the two cars, and we'll see if any answers come in. Normally there's a fairly even split on these. And as you're thinking about, well, which is better value, I'd ask, well, what criteria are you using to make your decision? And actually, what on earth does this have to do with pharmaceuticals? So what we're doing really with this is making a decision based on a balance of criteria that are relevant to pharmaceuticals. So we've got cost, of course, there's efficacy there, there's safety, and there's quality of life. And what I typically see when we do this in a room and you have a show of hands or whatever, there's a bit of a mix of Smart or Porsche. And what that shows is that different people have different value drivers, and different stakeholders, therefore, have different value drivers. So when we're thinking about evidence and communication, we need to address the needs of a range of different audiences. The other thing I'd add when we're thinking of evidence and value, we want to give patients access to treatments that will improve their outcomes. A barrier to that is always going to be budget from a health policy perspective. Now, we might have decided from our analysis that even though the Porsche is more expensive than the Smart, it may actually be better value. The analogy here is new medicines. We often find a lot of new medicines cost an awful lot more than the existing standard of care, but they offer much improved outcomes. Now, here's a scenario in place. Let's say we've got the cost of these cars. If you had a company that had 10 employees, 8 salespeople, a secretary and the CEO, you have to buy a car for every employee. You have to choose a Smart or a Porsche, but you only have a budget of 200,000 euros. Which would you choose? Now, this is a budget impact question. It's the kind of question that policymakers commonly face. You know that the Porsche is better value, but you simply don't have enough money this year to buy a Porsche for everyone. That leads to difficult decisions. Do you buy everyone the Smart? I mean, that's an equal allocation of resources, but is it right for everyone? Will it be better accepted by some? Do you buy the Smart for some people, a Porsche for others? But then how do you justify treating people unequally? What's your decision criteria? These are the sorts of decisions that health systems have to make. And the key to getting, I think, the right decision for patients is, of course, evidence of value. So I talked a little bit about some aspects of value already, but when we're doing evidence planning, it's important to think broadly about value. ISPOR is the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. You've probably heard of them. They developed a few years ago their value flower, and that's intended to summarize elements of value for all stakeholders. You certainly see a couple in orange there that anyone familiar with HTA assessments will know: QALYs gained and net costs. In red are some that come up in jurisdictions that use a societal perspective, so for example, work productivity. But there's a whole load in blue here that they added, and these are elements of value that have been applied in assessments, but probably sporadically. And a lot of these address a patient perspective or a caregiver perspective. So some of the examples there: reduction in uncertainty, the value of hope, equity. And that broad perspective is really important when we're planning for evidence generation. Now, most people have probably seen some version of this graphic before. It's done the rounds for a number of years. But what it illustrates rather nicely, I think, is the requirement for evidence during a product lifecycle. Green is how things used to be in a sort of pre-HTA world, which is that most of the evidence is needed around submission and launch. And after that, you only really need to develop evidence if you have a new indication or a new competitor or something. Blue is how things are now, and essentially there's significant demand for evidence throughout a product lifecycle. And I've put in the blue box there something that's very important, and that's to understand the regulator and HTA or payer needs very early on. And that's through things like early scientific advice or joint scientific consultation. Now, if you can nab a spot, they're not easy to come by. You're going to have to develop a lot of evidence over the life cycle. So it's really important to develop the right evidence and that you start off on the right track. So that sort of advice is key. So that slide talked about how much evidence and when, but what do different decision makers need? Regulators, as Eric alluded to, are reasonably straightforward. They need evidence of efficacy and safety. The question they're basically asking is, does efficacy outweigh any safety concerns? Now, the overwhelming problem we see when pharma and biotech companies have trouble with access and with uptake is that their clinical development and evidence programs are mostly targeted at regulators. The focus is still on marketing authorization. And this is a problem because then when you come to, for example, HTA agencies and payers, they ask a whole lot more questions. First of all, they're comparing you with the current standard of care. And it's not just efficacy and safety they're looking at, it's overall value. So they're asking questions like, is there evidence of an unmet need? Not only does the treatment work, but is it better than the standard of care? Is it better in particular populations? Is it worth it? Can we afford it? That budget question. Does it improve patient outcomes? What do patients think of it? And a sort of policy related question at the bottom: can we say no? And that's why we really need a strong integrated evidence generation plan, this IEGP, that we're going to talk a little more about. And for most of our stakeholders, we need to be showing how our product goes beyond a current standard of care. And that means improving clinical outcomes, patient outcomes, productivity, avoiding healthcare costs. But quantifying this differential value requires evidence. Now, those of you in Europe and probably beyond will be aware that joint clinical assessment, JCA, has now begun in the EU. This is a very detailed slide. I just want everyone to take two things away from it. One, there's an awful lot to do for JCA. And two, there isn't much time to do it in. If you look at the timelines here, after the EMA process begins, there's 120 days scoping, and then there's 100 days for a manufacturer to develop its JCA dossier. That's really not enough time to do anything else. And what that means is an early integrated evidence generation plan and a publication plan to follow are more important than ever before. You've got to have everything lined up before you start the JCA process. So let's talk about integrated evidence generation plans. And I'm first going to get away with how this is different from what manufacturers have always done. So traditionally, evidence generation planning has been quite siloed. R&D did studies for regulatory approval, medical affairs for HCPs, market access and HUR focused on dossiers for payers. Post-launch, then the countries did studies for their own local audiences. Now, this clearly is not optimal. There's not joined up thinking here. R&D's planning studies, they're planning for regulators, but they're not thinking about what questions payers and HTAs will be asking. And by the way, if I advance the slide here, where's the patient perspective in here. Where's the caregiver's perspective in here? So the way we've traditionally done evidence generation planning is pretty siloed. I will show you what a really good integrated evidence generation plan looks like. But first, I want to be sure we're not falling into the trap of thinking we're doing integrated planning when actually we're not. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago that's basically said that cross-functional planning should not be a potluck party. So what I mean by that is some manufacturers say, yes, we have an integrated evidence plan. When you look at it, it's actually all of those separate plans, and they just smoosh them together into one document and say, here's the integrated plan. And that's what I called a potluck approach to evidence planning. Okay, so the potluck party principle is everyone brings a plate of food, they make the choice, and then you put them all on a table and everyone goes and eats. And the problems with that, as the slide says, and as I put in the paper, 3 or 4 people come with sausage rolls, nobody brings a salad. So if we're thinking in evidence terms, that means some activities get repeated. They're done by lots of different people, but there are some evidence gaps in there and some stakeholder gaps that nobody addresses. So we don't want to do that. And what we actually want is a truly integrated evidence generation process, which looks a bit like this. The first point to note is that it brings together all relevant functions. So we have commercial in there, we've got patient engagement, we've got publications, we have local affiliates involved early, not just after something's been launched. And the second difference is that all of these functions work together on developing one plan for all stakeholders. It's not lots of individual plans, it's all working together on one plan. So that sounds great. What do we actually do? Here's an overview of an IAGP process, and quickly going through it, you start off with the strategic drivers, the imperatives for the product and the company. You then feed in what are the needs from an evidence perspective of your stakeholders, so regulators, HTAs, payers, patient groups. Identify the evidence gaps. Now, there are always too many gaps to address realistically, so you need to prioritize them. You then think, what are the study options we have to fill those gaps? Once you've chosen your studies, you then have your evidence generation plan. And then, this is the key point for today, you should use this to develop your strategic publication plan, because we want to communicate this great evidence to people. And the final point is that this is an iterative process. You may go through it a year later when things have moved on a bit. Now, I'm going to advance the slide to add a little more detail. I'm not going to go into a huge amount on this because I think we'll be able to share the slides, but just to fill in some of the gaps. When you're identifying evidence needs, so that's at step 2, this is where things like early scientific advice and joint scientific consultation are really key, along with stakeholder interviews. And then when we're looking at the evidence we have, that's a mixture of the current plan, it's the published literature that's out there. We're then identifying what are the gaps in the evidence plan. A key part then is the workshop. So that's step 4. You should have cross-functional, cross-geographic workshops where we're bringing people together and we're aligning around these evidence needs and prioritizing the evidence gaps. And then the publication planning piece. We know here where are the key decision points for our stakeholders. We know what we need the evidence for when. So let's then plan, let's publish it. So we make sure it's out in time for a particular decision point. Now, I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail on a couple of these. One of those is the study options. This is an excerpt from a nice paper that was published last year in the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research. And it essentially shows the sort of approach you take when considering study options. It's a decision tree. It asks, do you have a published randomized controlled trial? If not, okay, can we do a meta-analysis of other trials? If not, okay, can we do some real-world evidence studies and so on? And it takes you through the thought process around what are the options for a particular study to answer a particular research question. And then when you get into planning studies in detail, you need to think, particularly if it's real world evidence, what are the data sources, what are the methodologies that you're going to address for the research question? And this really should be a systematic process, because you want to be able to show when decision makers ask, why did you choose that data source? Why did you choose that methodology? That you've done it in an appropriate way and you've not just picked the most readily available. And you should make sure this aligns with relevant guidelines, such as NICE. Groups such as NICE have an advice program for this kind of thing. They have their NICE advice evidence gap analysis, which if you do it fast track can take about 6 weeks. And actually some of you, when we're talking about data sources, you may have seen on the news today, the UK government and the Wellcome Trust have invested in a centralized medical data repository, this health data research service. So the idea is that this will provide a single access point for scientists to view NHS data sets in the UK. And this could well be a great source when you're thinking of evidence in the future. So I'm getting close to handing over to Suzanne and talking a bit more about publications. If we've got a robust IEGP, we should have good data coming through. I'm just going to put up now some of the challenges that you can face potentially with advancing to publications. And I've picked on market access and HOR teams here. And some of the challenges they may come up with are, for example, there's no mandate to publish a lot of the work they do. So there's a mandate to publish randomized controlled trials, to register them and so on. But for real world studies, for economic models, there's no mandate. So we don't have to publish them. Why are we publishing them then? We have HTA dossiers. So we've got a direct channel through to the decision makers, and we can put data on file in those dossiers. That's accepted. So why bother with publishing in scientific journals? This is a challenge I think you'll address. And the reason publications matter is because most decision-making processes, and HTA in particular, rely on systematic literature reviews. So all relevant published evidence gets evaluated. So if your evidence is published, it's authored by clinical experts, it's in a high-quality peer-reviewed journal, that gives it credibility and weight well beyond submitting it as a data on file. So really, publications do matter. And at this point, I need to mention a law described by the health economist Martin Buxton. It's always too early for rigorous evaluation of a new technology until, unfortunately, it's suddenly too late. Essentially, with that, if we want to publish evidence ahead of HTA evaluations and so on, we really do need to start early because there's a time lag to all publication processes. And that therefore means that the strategic publications plan before that and the IEGP have to begin early as well. And this is my final slide, and it's an example of good practice. We've talked about the importance of demonstrating value, that different stakeholders think of value in different ways, and we need an integrated evidence plan and publications that address all of these various elements of value. So if anyone watching this is from BioMarin, I'm about to say some nice things about what you did, in particular for the NICE re-evaluation of Vimizim. So just summarizing this slide, Vimizim's treatment for rare disease that was definitely a Porsche in terms of cost, but considered at initial evaluation of uncertain value. So it had to undergo a re-evaluation by NICE. And I really wanted to flag here in the middle column the types of study that were done for that re-evaluation. So there was a real-world evidence study showing outcomes of Vimizim in clinical practice, but a quant patient survey, a qualitative caregiver survey, a qualitative patient advocacy survey. And if you look at the NICE guidance document, which was a positive decision, it called out the positive impact of this range of evidence on the final decision. So I think this is a great example of better research leading to, because of the positive evaluation, better outcomes for patients. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Richard. Suzanne Schiller. I'm a 30-year veteran in medical communications agency side. I actually started my career at a publisher now known as Lippincott, Williams & Wilkins prior to that. And I've been extremely active in the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals, actually a charter member, and sat as chair on the Certified Medical Publication, the CMPP, the Certification Program Committee. So we're gonna, as Eric mentioned, and Richard so lovely, did a lovely job setting this up, we're gonna look at strategic publication planning in context of IEGP. IEGP, integrated evidence generation planning, is really essential piece of the puzzle here, because without evidence, you really don't have support for your submission or for approvals. The overall data dissemination strategy and plan, we're going to now take a deeper look into the why, the what, and the how, as Eric mentioned, sort of more of practicalities around that. So next slide. Sorry, I'm not driving. You can put both, you can hit the next button. So why do we need a publication plan? Most organizations, many organizations have a dedicated publication function that could be comprised of perhaps one individual or multiple individuals, depending on the size of the organization. Their focus is on complete and accurate communication of all data sets. So as Richard just demonstrated, it's not necessarily all about the clinical trial data. We look at evidence as complete evidence, inclusive of any evidence generated by health economics and outcomes research, and also the real world evidence that comes later on, and communicating that data to the scientific and medical community in a timely, impactful, and efficient way. What do we mean by impactful? Getting the data out and communicating to the right audience through the appropriate channel, meet them where they need to be met and where they prefer to be met at the right time. So when we're thinking about a publication plan, we're considering a lot of different factors that are going to impact that plan. In terms of not only the data itself, so the existing data, the evidence that is anticipated when you look at that overall integrated evidence generation plan, but also looking overarchingly at the scientific story. What do you want to communicate about the asset in development, about what that evidence is supporting? Some of those communications messages as part of the overall scientific story could be aspirational. So we're waiting for that evidence to support what we want to say about that asset. There's also the audiences to consider. Who cares about this evidence? Who do we want to communicate with and tell that story to? What are our competitors saying? How is this different, and how do we want to position that in terms of the science itself? And also what hasn't been communicated yet. So in the literature, taking a look, I'll cover this in a minute, taking a look overall at the literature, what hasn't been said? What hasn't been said about the disease? Maybe there's new things that have been learned about the actual disease. Maybe there's changes in standard of care. Maybe it's a new mechanism of action that has yet to be explored and written about and communicated. Next slide. So the publications function is typically aligned to medical affairs, and this is a framework put out by the Medical Affairs Professional Society, looking at launch excellence for medical affairs professionals. And the reason why I'm sharing this is to show that the data dissemination and evidence generation line, which is the peach color here, is really critical to supporting that launch from a medical affairs perspective. The other thing that's important to note is the timing. So looking at this 2 to 4 years ahead of launch and life cycle, you're already starting to think about it. So that Buxton quote that Richard shared is very relevant here. It is never too early, even when you're just entering it. We actually prefer to engage in these programs and start thinking about strategic evidence dissemination before phase 3 even initiates, because we want to get input on what that phase 3 study looks like in terms of design. We want to get input from not only the scientific advisors and experts, but importantly, the patients to help, define those endpoints. So what medical affairs tries to do is engage those key stakeholders very early in the process, which is what this illustrates here. So in the end and you can go to the next slide, the overall, the strategic publications plan really does help build that foundational evidence to support a compelling scientific story that is told through various and sundry activities that were illustrated on the last slide. And the evidence base, the volume of the evidence base itself is relative to the product life cycle. So obviously, as you move through the phases, more evidence is generated. There's more to say, and there's more to support and strengthen that scientific story that you're communicating to your stakeholder audiences. So hopefully you're getting the idea how the integrated evidence generation plan is inextricably tied to strategic publications planning, and one can't live without the other, really. Also, there might be, for a single asset, multiple indications. So there might be publications work streams happening simultaneously in launch, post-launch, with life cycle real-world evidence for an initial indication, and then maybe starting to communicate out proof of concept or phase 2 data for the next indication. So there's a lot of balls in the air. There's a lot to juggle, which is why you need a very structured, thoughtful plan that is managed proactively. Next slide. Just reiterating and resharing what Richard already showed. This graphic is actually lifted initially from the EMA Adaptive Pathways program, which is literally a scientific concept for medicine development and data generation that uses the EMA regulatory framework to map out early and progressive access by stakeholders, and particularly patients, throughout the life cycle. The other thing that this illustrates and emphasizes is the fact that IEGP, once again, we cannot drum this in enough. It's a cross-functional exercise. So it's a multidisciplinary approach, accounting for perspectives from across the organization. So including not only clinical development and then regulatory to understand, what those needs are, but also HEOR, RWE, patient advocacy is pretty critical here to represent the voice of the patient, and also commercial. That has not been mentioned yet, but in the end, it's really all about how we're marketing, and you want to build that evidence base to support a very strong and compelling scientific story that will motivate behavior change to accept, promote access to the asset. Next slide. So getting to what actually is a strategic publication plan, it is an organized, systematic approach to dissemination of all data sets, as I already mentioned, scientific, clinical, HEOR, real-world evidence, through a variety of channels and formats to reach the target audiences for maximum impact. So again, reiterating, what does impact mean? Impact is reaching the right audiences at the right time through the appropriate channel. So meeting them where they want to access that information. So the communication objectives specifically, once we establish the strategic imperatives, which I'll get to in a minute, what evidence are we communicating? Think about, is it preclinical, translational, RWE? Is it a literature review or meta-analysis of the literature? Why? Is it to communicate safety, efficacy, mechanism of action, mechanism of disease, maybe talking about unmet needs, fulfilling some educational gaps in the landscape? Maybe it's competitive differentiation. Who are we talking to? So it's not only about the physicians and prescribers, but at the extended care team. So nurses, allied health professionals, pharmacists, patients, importantly, payers and regulators also very importantly. How do we want to do local, national, international congresses, journals with a narrow or broader audience, specialist journals, thinking about the readership, and the timing relative to data availability or regulatory submission. Are we in launch, lead up to launch? Are we on post-launch commercialization mode? And putting everything in context of where you are in the life cycle is going to be important to consider. And then finally, that's all wrapped up in a tactical plan that ensures timely publication of the evidence, align with the cross-functional team objectives and priorities, which will change over time. Next slide. So starting with creating the strategy and conducting the landscape assessment. The landscape assessment is really critical to informing development of a SWOT. So a SWOT analysis, looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that can be addressed through a well thought out evidence and communication plan. Evidence generation and communication plan, excuse me. So looking at the landscape and looking at the literature landscape specifically, there's a lot out there. So what's going to be an important consideration is to set parameters in terms of not only time points, we're looking 3 years back, 5 years back, 10 years back, 10 years back. That's a huge lift. Are we looking at specific geographies and putting limits on that? And also importantly, what are the topics that we're looking at? So those keywords are going to be critical to fencing in that landscape assessment, to ensuring that it gets what you need in terms of a snapshot of what is the current literature landscape look like, what is being said, what is already out there, what has already been addressed, and what has yet to be said, what are the gaps that need to be filled. And we approach it through a couple of different ways. There's a quantitative assessment looking at sheer numbers and counts of topics and types of publications and where they're being published. And then there's a qualitative assessment, which importantly needs a human touch there, looking at what are the current descriptors, who are the populations being addressed, what are the different themes and differentiators. This is important. The qualitative assessment coupled with the quantitative assessment is important to look at and uncover where the gaps are in the literature and see where we might want to fill those gaps. So maybe there's things out there that have been published in only a select few journals, but maybe there are other channels or venues that these stakeholder audiences are accessing where they're not necessarily getting the information they need that are relevant to the asset that is in development for that organization. And this, you can stay on here. This is also kind of critical in informing the IEGP as well. So Richard, I know, touched on this, but the landscape assessment is extremely useful in helping develop and inform and refine that integrated evidence generation plan. So you can go to the next slide. In terms of the elements of a publication plan, this is an indicative example of a publication plan development over time. And you can see it's a very long process. This is a programmatic initiative. It's not a one and done. It's highly iterative, as Richard did mention, and we cannot emphasize this enough. This is never one and done. I think both Richard and I started when the publication plan, it started our careers when a publication plan was literally in a binder. You put it in what used to be your credenza when you had an office, actually, and it just sat there. These days, publication plans typically live in PowerPoint, so they're easily updated and evolved over time. So looking at the top bucket, the top band, the strategic projects you can see extended across the entire life of the publication program. So you're still doing that assessment of the landscape over time. So as you add and contribute to the literature, you're reassessing to see what else is out there, what's living next to it, what is complementing or countering what's already been out there, which in turn informs what else can you do from a evidence dissemination and publications standpoint, and importantly, broader communications program standpoint to address what's out there. The other important piece of this, in addition to the literature analysis, landscape assessment, is that scientific platform that I talked about earlier. That is critical. Having a compelling scientific story that is consistently communicated through these publications, whatever we're putting through, is extremely important. That consistency is going to be what your stakeholders and your target audience is going to take away and remember. What 3 things, just remember, what 3 things do you want them to know about your asset, or about what you're saying about the disease or the unmet needs or the limitations of current treatments? And that scientific platform and lexicon grows and strengthens over time as these publications come out. So as you build that foundational evidence, those aspirational messages become reality, and you can really start to push those messages through your publications program. So who gets involved? Again, reiterating the theme of multidisciplinary and cross-function. The publications planning process is and always should be a multidisciplinary and cross-functional exercise. So there typically is publications lead, as mentioned. It could be a team of 1 or 20 or more, but that function orchestrates and facilitates a multidisciplinary approach, accounting for inputs from a variety of functions across the organization to inform, develop, and evolve that strategic publications plan. So the other stakeholders noted here again, I just want to note commercial and business strategy can have a seat at the table. They can advise and request, but to uphold really the integrity of the science, we oftentimes the medical affairs is mediating and kind of directing and making the ultimate decision into what is actually communicated and what actually ends up in the publication program, because we want to temper that influence from the commercial side. Next slide. So these are just a cut. I think there's another little box in there. Yeah, there we go. So the publication plan itself, as I mentioned, can take many forms depending on the development stage, company size, needs, preferences. There's many people I've worked with that might come from a publications function in one company and then joins another company, and they want it to look like what they did before. Other people want to adopt what is already there. Others defer to perhaps they're working with an external agency partner, and they like that format better. So it comes in a variety of formats, but really what it does is help map out what data, where are we going to communicate that data, and when are we going to communicate that data? And the whole publication program is managed according to that plan. So plotting out the timings and where things are going to be presented or submitted is pretty much the bottom line here of what we want to do. I just want to make a mention about venues and criteria to consider when you're looking at congresses and journals. The availability of the data obviously is critical. So if we're going for a Congress to unveil some pivotal data through a poster presentation, hopefully we want to get an oral or a podium presentation acceptance. Sometimes we're down to the wire because the data might not be available, or Biostats is still crunching those numbers maybe a week before the submission is due. So there could be late breakers involved there. So the data availability is something that's critical to consider clearly from an evidence generation standpoint. The audience, who cares about this data? Who is this most relevant to? And you also want to match that content, of how you're communicating the evidence to the scope of whether it's a Congress or, importantly, the journal. So looking at the editorial content of the journal and making sure that it's a fit to inform, what we're recommending in terms of submitting to. The impact factor or circulation and readership are also key considerations, as well as geographic reach. Timing of the peer review process in general is a key consideration. The higher tier journals, and we always joke about, do you want prestige or speed? Because a lot of times the higher tier journals, a lot of folks we work with, I want to go to the New England Journal. I want to go to British Medical Journal. Well, the peer review process could take 6 12 months or even more? Is there another journal that reaches the specialist audience or the core target audience that you want to deliver this evidence to, communicate this evidence to? Are there other venues that they also read and will have equal impact? So looking at all those considerations, what journals have published data on this topic in the past? Are the data transformative, informative, or supportive? That will help steer where you're going to put it. And all those recommendations in terms of target venues, target congresses will show up in this plan. Next slide. So executing the plan. So once the plan's in place, now you have to make it happen. Now you have to mobilize the team and get the work done, pushing things through review, development, writing, drafting. All those things need to be managed with an eye on maintaining accuracy, quality, and efficiency. So collaboration, again, we're going to say this word 1,000 times, is so key and critical. Upholding a rigorous process, really, to manage multiple publications. There's a lot of balls in the air. There could be multiple Congress submissions going to 7 different Congresses. You have 7 abstracts going to 7 different Congresses, plus 3 publications in the work. One of them is a pivotal that needs to move along. Every single one of those activities has a different set of authors and reviewers and people involved that need to be managed. So the whole tracking and transparency is something that's very important to remember, because you're tracking things along a continuum, but there are multiple work streams going. So collaboration and communication is really, really critical there. This is a good time to consider how and when to use AI. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address AI, which oftentimes is the elephant in the room. And AI can help realize efficiencies with your publications program, but we're not there in terms of adopting it fully, because the human element is so essential to help really maintain the integrity of the plan and help ensure accuracy. But this illustrates some areas and highlights some areas where AI might be used to summarize and distill large sets of information to help maybe generate an initial draft of an abstract or a paper or a manuscript, maybe answering some very specific questions, helping you refine that narrative or that story. But there is guidance that is being developed. ISMAP actually has a task force that are trying to establish some guidance and recommendations on utilization of AI in strategic publications programming in general. But every single guidance and recommendation out there currently is really emphasizing the fact that you cannot remove the human element from this process, particularly when it comes to disseminating evidence. And because there are so many nuances around there, that you really do need that human element to avoid hallucinations and all the risks and gaps that could come up with utilization of AI. So as the publication plan is implemented and we're starting to get our evidence out there, we're asking ourselves the question, who else do we need to talk to? So as the evidence is disseminated, we're going to get some feedback from the stakeholders we're engaging with and saying, hey, you should really be talking to pharmacists about this, or patients and caregivers really need to know about that. So going back to the plan and refining it, and perhaps adding in or adjusting different kinds of initiatives that might reach relevant audiences or geographies, and looking to address geographies and different audiences through perhaps sub-analyses, looking at different relevant subpopulations, relevant data sets for specific parts of the subpopulations that we're trying to reach. The publication enhancers and extenders is another great way to amplify the publication program. If you want to go to the next slide, show you what we mean there. We're talking about looking at value and amortizing the publication over time. So particularly looking at posters and looking at innovative poster designs. This poster, it's very tiny. I'm sorry for the teeniness of it. But a better poster design helps really guide the reader or the viewer to the most critical and relevant information. So that would, we don't necessarily need to fit into what a traditional poster looks like all the time. And maybe adding a QR code will help us track and look at metrics. So amplify these different kinds of enhancements that we do also help provide us with additional ways to measure the impact of our publications. So the audio and video recordings, especially with expert presentations of the data, really helps enhance the credibility of the publication and of the evidence. Looking at the unbiased review of the data and unbiased presentation, because everybody understands people learn differently. You can learn by reading, or maybe some people learn better by listening and listening to a video. There's also plain language summaries over here on the far right corner. The plain language summaries really is a nice distillation of the data with some visuals to help it make the data more accessible to a broader, perhaps lay audience. And then there's content enhancements that many journals actually offer and do themselves. They might get a submission and decide they want to create an animation of a graphic to illustrate a mechanism of disease or a mechanism of action for the asset that's something new and novel. So the submission can either you can accompany your submission with that, or sometimes journals themselves will create those enhancements. And these are all ways to optimize value and reinforce the importance of the evidence and to the asset, and really help highlight why the evidence matters, putting it in context.
Suzanne, I'm sorry to break your flow, but I'm just conscious of time, and we want to leave some time for questions. So
yes,
I don't know how many
we're
slides you've got.
done.
Could
We're
you wrap
almost
up
done.
in
We're
30
almost
seconds?
done.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry.
We're taking it home. So the publication, how do we navigate all of this? There's a plethora of guidelines out there, and I just want to reinforce the word guidelines and recommendations. There's no laws or rules of the road around strategic publication programming, but there are a host of guidelines, and I want to hone in on the Good Publication Practice Guideline, which is key guidance for company-sponsored biomedical research and really is the backbone for development of high-quality publications. And the GPP was established years ago. There's been multiple iterations and updates to that. And they really do put the recommendations from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors in context in terms of authorship criteria and transparency. But there's also a whole other bunch of guidelines here. A great resource is the Equator Network. Encourage everybody to go to that. It sort of consolidates all the guidelines that are out there and helps effective navigation of those guidelines to help provide those perspectives. But these are also, what's important to remember with these guidelines is they're all represent different perspectives. So the GPP is a product of collaboration between agency, journal editors, and publishers, and industry side. The ICMJE is obviously journal editors, and the WAMI guidelines are obviously writers. So there's a bunch of different perspectives here from different stakeholders who are all involved and have a different, see the strategic publications planning process through a different lens. So these guidelines can be very useful. ISMAP is an organization that actually I don't know if people get the gist now, there's actually a whole profession dedicated to publication planning. And the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals does have a certified medical publication professional credential that that is sponsored and offers ongoing education to help folks uphold that CMPP credential. There's a host of benefits and educational resources. You can go to the next slide that ISMAP offers, and we have highlighted over here some free ones that are accessible to non-members. You can take a look at. These might be relevant for this audience here, and the QR code, if you want to scan that, it'll take you right to ISMAP, or just ISMAP, www.ismap.org. And ISMAP is here to help and mentor and provide advice and to really help navigate those guidelines and the complex world that is strategic publication planning.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard and Suzanne. We've got 5 minutes left for questions. I've got a dozen questions, but I'm going to prioritize the 2 questions that are in the chat from our participants. So I'm going to give the first one to Richard. How do I convince my colleagues that some of those less typical internal groups like patient advocacy should be part of the IEGP discussion?
That's a great question. And it's one we encounter a lot with IEGPs, mainly because of the history of evidence. We saw that siloed approach. R&D's used to doing clinical development plans, market access and HOR do the payer bit. So if then other people are perceived to be muscling in, why do you have a say in my evidence plan? Then it is a challenge. I would say it helps you to develop a convincing story of value at the end. So just taking the patient advocacy example, if you have a nice early IEGP, the patient input can be really important in shaping the right outcomes for your trials, running the trials in the right way, incorporating, for example, a patient-reported outcome measure at an early stage rather than getting to it later and thinking, gosh, I wish we'd done that at registration. So it does help with a broader picture of value throughout. And trying to overcome those traditional hierarchies is something we see a lot with IEGPs, but in the end, it just makes it a more convincing set of evidence when you come to talk to the regulators, and particularly payers and HTA.
And I think, thanks, Rich. And I think it's partly about rules and incentives being in the right place, because I think people work within the rules that they're given. And it's incomprehensible to me, lots of things about the industry in which we work, especially when we compare it to other industries and the relationship that these industries have with demand and supply. We're very fragmented in terms of demand and supply. It is astonishing that we continue to get away with it, but we work within the rules that we're given. And the incentives are all in the wrong place. And I think until the rules are better and the incentives are in the right place, then we won't get patient advocacy where it needs to be until it almost is part of the rules. And I've got tons of questions that we won't get to on that bit. Maybe another day, Richard, if we can follow up on this through an email collaboration, we can have a deeper discussion about it. So another question for Suzanne, you put a very good SWOT up there. I've got slide envy every time I see your slides. But one of our participants has asked about, could you explain briefly why is a SWOT framework suitable for conducting the gap analysis? And are there any other alternative methods that could be considered in addition to or as an alternative to a SWOT?
Well, the idea of the landscape assessment and gap analysis is to inform development or evolution of the SWOT. So the SWOT isn't necessarily a framework for the gap analysis, but if you turn it on its head, the landscape assessment and evidence gap analysis will in turn help create that look and uncover the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the form, it's actually a really good question because I didn't really share any illustrative examples of what a landscape assessment looks like, because I cannot tell you how many shapes and forms it could possibly come in. And also, considering the scope and scale of what a landscape assessment could be. But it's a SWOT, I think, is important from a strategic standpoint. And in order to evolve, create and a good strategy and have a solid foundation for that strategy, that really is what the landscape assessment does. It gives you a good basis for the why behind why are we creating this strategy? Why do we need to communicate this evidence? Well, here's the current state of the state. Here's what the literature landscape looks like now. And here's where we want to get it to with our evidence. So building that foundational evidence. And then the SWOT considerations really do help inform the actual plan and the tactics that will come out of that landscape assessment.
Excellent. So I've got a minute to summarize. So first off, thank you to Richard and Suzanne for 2 excellent presentations. We will send the slides round and we hope these will be disseminated really, really widely. I am utterly convinced about integrated evidence generation plans. It makes perfect sense to me that we should be doing this, and we work in a complex system, and a system only works well if it has the right inputs. And in our system, we need good evidence, we need better evidence. And while we need to see improvements and flexibilities in all parts of the system will never flex enough to accommodate poor evidence. And it seems to me, while there's lots of things that can be done to improve evidence, having an integrated evidence generation plan is absolutely fundamental. And to go back to Richard's car analogy, it seems to me that it's the fuel that goes in the car, because whether you want a smart car or a Porsche isn't the most important question. The question is, does it do what it says on the tin? And if it doesn't have energy, if it doesn't have fuel, it will do nothing. It will sit on your driveway. So we need better evidence, and an integrated evidence generation plan to me is key. So I hope the audience is convinced. I hope this is just the first of many interactions we will have on this topic through EMIG. So thank you very much to EMIG. Thank you to our presenters, and I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you.